The snow fell in thick, silent curtains over the ruins of Yokohama, blanketing the broken city in white that could not hide the black char beneath. February 14th, 1946, Valentine's Day. Though such sentiments seemed obscene in a world still smoking from war's funeral pyre. Miyako Tanaka pressed her thin body against the skeletal remains of what had once been a pharmacy, her breath forming small clouds that disappeared into the cold. 23 years old, and she felt ancient. The war had taken her father to Manchuria, her brother to Okinawa, and her mother to pneumonia the previous winter. Now she lived alone in a single room of a partially collapsed boarding house, teaching English to children whose parents hoped American favor might mean extra rations. She shouldn't have been out here. The American occupation forces had declared this sector off-limits to civilians after dark, but hunger made people reckless. The rumor of unguarded supplies 3 blocks east had been too tempting to ignore. 2 days since her last meal, 2 days of teaching verb conjugations while her stomach ate itself. In her coat pocket, she carried her most valuable possession. Not food, not money, a small notebook with careful English translations. Her wartime work, propaganda translator for the Imperial Information Bureau. She'd spent 3 years turning American radio broadcasts into Japanese warnings, translating enemy promises into proof of Western deceit. Americans are barbarians. They have no culture beyond violence. They will destroy everything beautiful and replace it with ugliness. She'd written those words herself. Believe them even. The firebombing of Tokyo had seemed to prove every warning true. The wind shifted, carrying voices, American voices rough with alcohol and cold. Miyako froze. Her English was fluent enough to catch fragments. Something about patrol routes. Something about being done soon. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She waited, counting her breaths until the voices faded toward the harbor district. Then she moved. The street opened into what had been a commercial plaza before the firebombing. Now it was a field of rubble interrupted by the occasional standing wall like broken teeth in a burned mouth. Miyako picked her way carefully, watching for landmarks. A red mailbox still somehow upright. A storefront with half its sign reading pharmacy in faded paint. She found neither. Instead, she found blood. It started as dark spots in the snow, easy to miss in the failing light. Then more, a trail of it leading deeper into the wreckage. Miyako's survival instinct screamed at her to turn back, but something else made her follow. Perhaps it was the irregularity of the pattern, the way the spots suggested someone crawling rather than walking. Perhaps it was simply that the war had shown her so much death that one more body seemed inevitable, and she'd rather know than wonder. The trail ended at a collapsed concrete wall that formed a kind of shelter, almost a cave, and there, barely visible in the shadows, was a man. He was enormous. Even curled on his side in the snow, he dwarfed her. An American soldier, she realized, seeing the torn remnants of a uniform. But something was wrong. The moonlight caught his face and Miyako's breath stopped. He was black. She'd seen black American soldiers before from a distance, usually in segregated units doing construction work or unloading supply ships. But never this close. Never alone. Never dying. Because he was dying. She could see it in the shallow rise of his chest, in the way frost gathered on his lips, in the massive dark stains spreading across his side where his uniform was torn. He'd been hurt badly, and whoever had hurt him had left him here to freeze. His eyes opened, brown eyes deep and pain-filled, staring at her across the impossible distance of war, occupation, race, and ruin. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Enemy and enemy, victim and victim, two people who should not exist in the same moment. Then his lips moved, forming words too quiet to hear. Miyako took a step closer, then another. The propaganda translations in her pocket seemed to burn against her chest. Americans are savages. They cannot be trusted. They have no honor. But this man was alone, abandoned, left to die in the snow. What honor was there in that? She knelt beside him, close enough now to see details. His uniform was torn, not by combat, but by something deliberate. The wound was wrong. Too clean in places, too ragged in others. This wasn't shrapnel. This was something else. His hand moved, reaching not for her, but towards something near his head. A military pack partially buried in snow. His fingers clawed weakly at it. Kitchen, he whispered, the word barely audible. Supplies. Miyako thought he was delirious, asking for food when dying. But she pulled the pack closer anyway, opened it. Inside, a first aid kit, bandages, iodine, morphine syringes, real medical supplies more than she'd seen in months. Beneath that, two small packages wrapped in wax paper and a cloth bag tied carefully labeled personal effects. She didn't examine further now. Getting him warm took priority. She looked at his face again. His eyes were clearer now, watching her with something like hope, something like resignation. "You help?" he asked, the English, simple, the question enormous. Every rational thought screamed at her to run. Helping an American soldier, any American soldier, was dangerous. Helping a black soldier might be worse. The segregation she'd observed among the occupation forces suggested complex tensions she didn't understand. And if he died in her care, if anyone discovered her with his body, the consequences could be severe. But his eyes held hers, and in them she saw something she recognized. Not pleading exactly, just a terrible, quiet knowledge. He knew he was dying, he knew he was alone, and he knew that even if she stayed, it probably wouldn't matter. That knowledge decided her. "I will help you," she said in careful English, the words strange in her mouth after years of translating hate. "Please don't be afraid." She had no idea if he understood. His eyes were already closing again, his breathing even more shallow. Miyako looked at his size, at her own thin arms, at the distance back to her room. 4 blocks. It might as well have been 40 miles. Impossible. She started trying anyway. What followed was a nightmare of effort in inches. She managed to help him move himself, supporting his weight, while he pushed with weakening legs. His blood left a trail in the snow behind them. When she found a burned delivery cart, she leveraged him onto it and pulled with strength born of pure stubbornness. Once she heard voices and had to drag both soldier and cart into shadows, her hand pressed over his mouth to muffle his labored breathing. The patrol passed within 10 feet of them. When they finally reached the boarding house, Miyako wanted to collapse, but the hardest part remained, getting him up the stairs to her second-floor room. The elderly landlady, Mrs. Helen Garrett, was nearly deaf and kept to her ground-floor apartment, but the stairs creaked terribly. She managed it somehow, step by agonizing step. They fell through her door together, and Miyako barely had the strength to push it closed before she collapsed beside him on the tatami mat floor. For long minutes, there was only the sound of breathing, his ragged and wet, hers sobbing with exhaustion. The tiny charcoal brazier in the corner provided minimal heat. Her whole room was perhaps 8 feet by 10, containing a sleeping mat, a small table, 2 cushions, a shelf with a dozen books, and little else. Everything she owned in the world. And now it also contained a dying American soldier who she'd just committed treason to save. The wound was worse than she'd feared. When Miyako finally peeled back the torn uniform, she found a deep gash running along his left side from just below his ribs, almost to his hip. The edges were ragged, the work of something metal and deliberate. This wasn't combat. This was murder. Interrupted, she boiled water on the brazier, using her last bit of precious coal. While it heated, she cut strips from her spare kimono. The soldier drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling words she couldn't catch. Once he said something that sounded like Marie, and another time Georgia. When the water was ready, Miyako began to clean the wound. He came fully awake with a strangled cry that made her freeze in terror, certain Mrs. Garrett would hear. His hand caught her wrist, gripping hard enough to bruise. "I must," she said in English, meeting his eyes. They were wide with pain, but also awareness. "This will hurt. I am sorry, but I must clean it, or infection will kill you." He stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly his grip loosened. He turned his face away, jaw clenched, and nodded once. Miyako worked as quickly and carefully as she could. Each touch of the hot cloth brought a new sound of pain from him, muffled against his arm. The wound was deep enough in places that she could see muscle tissue, maybe deeper. She used the iodine sparingly, knowing it was all she had. The soldier nearly passed out when she poured it directly into the deepest part of the wound. Then she bandaged it with her makeshift strips, wrapping them around his torso as tightly as she dared. When it was done, he was gray-faced and soaked with sweat, despite the cold. Miyako herself felt hollow, as if she'd poured out something essential. But the wound was clean and bound. It was something. She got his wet clothes off, covered him with her blankets, all 3 of them. But it wasn't enough. The room was too cold, the brazier's heat too weak, the blankets too thin. His shivering had stopped, which she knew was a terrible sign. It meant his body was giving up the fight to stay warm. Miyako removed her outer layers until she wore only her thin undergarment. Then, heart pounding, she crawled beneath the blankets beside him. The cold of his skin shocked her. It was like lying next to ice. She pressed herself against his uninjured side, wrapping her arms around him, trying to share what little warmth she had. For a long time, nothing seemed to change. He remained terribly cold, his breathing shallow. Miyako talked to him, sometimes in Japanese, sometimes in English, saying anything to keep herself awake. She told him about her students, about the city before the war, about her father who loved American jazz music. Gradually, so slowly, she almost didn't notice she felt warmth beginning to return to his skin. His breathing deepened slightly. Once his arm moved settling around her. Miyako allowed it, pressing closer, willing her own body heat into him. Somewhere near dawn, she felt him stir. His eyes opened, focusing on her face inches from his own. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he whispered, his voice rough but clearer than before. Waikyo, Miyako thought about all the complex answers she could give. About shared humanity. About the war having taken enough already. Instead, she said simply, because I could. Something shifted in his expression. It might have been the beginning of tears, or perhaps just the fever she could feel building in him. He closed his eyes again, but his arm tightened slightly around her. James, he whispered. My name is James Washington. Miyako Tanaka, she replied. Rest now, James Washington. You are safe. It was a lie, of course. He was a wounded black soldier hidden in the room of a Japanese woman during hostile occupation. There was nothing safe about any of it. But in that moment, wrapped together against the cold and the world, it was the truth they both needed. James's fever broke on the second day, spiked again on the third, and finally settled into a low, constant burn on the fourth. Miyako barely left his side except to fetch water from the communal pump and teach her morning English class. She couldn't afford to lose even that small income. She told her students she had a cold, wrapped a cloth around her face, and kept the lesson short and simple. The children didn't seem to notice her distraction, too busy practicing their pronunciation. Good morning, thank you very much. America is our friend now. The words felt like ash in her mouth. Mrs. Garrett asked once about the increased water usage. Miyako claimed she was washing clothes, showed her a basket of wet fabric as proof. The old woman nodded, satisfied, her hearing too poor to catch the occasional sounds from upstairs. Still, Miyako lived in terror of discovery. Every footstep in the hall made her heart race. She kept James as quiet as possible, her hand ready to cover his mouth when others were near. He drifted between sleep and waking, sometimes lucid, sometimes lost in fever dreams. In his delirious times, he talked. Fragments of a life Miyako was only beginning to understand. He spoke of Georgia, red dirt and pine trees and heat that made Japan's summer seem mild. His mother Ruth, who made something called collard greens. His sister Marie sang in a church choir. And he talked about France, about combat, about things that made Miyako realize the war had been just as brutal for him as it had been for her. Once in clear-headed moment on the fourth evening, he asked, "You got any idea the risk you're taking?" Miyako was changing his bandages, relieved to see that the wound looked cleaner, the angry red fading to pink at the edges. I know, she said simply. If they find me here, they'll say you're harboring a deserter. Or worse, Oberis. I know. He shook his head slowly. You're either the bravest person I ever met, or the craziest. Maybe both, Miyako agreed with a small smile. She finished tying off the bandage. The wound was healing slowly but surely. He'd lost weight, his face gaunt, but the fever was dropping. He was going to survive. You should eat something, she said. I have rice and some dried fish. You got enough. His eyes searched her face. Don't look like you're eating regular yourself. It was true. Miyako had been eating even less than usual, saving most of her rations for James. Her clothes hung looser than ever. But she waved off his concern. I am fine. You need strength to heal. She prepared a small meal on the brazier, watering down the rice to make it stretch. They ate in silence, James struggling to sit up enough to feed himself. He managed half the bowl before exhaustion claimed him again. As Miyako cleaned up, she found herself thinking about the cruel mathematics of war and peace. During the fighting, the enemy had been clear. Anyone wearing the wrong uniform, speaking the wrong language. Now in the messy aftermath, the lines were blurred. Here was an American soldier, technically an enemy occupier hidden in her room. But the real enemies had been other Americans who'd beaten him and left him to die. And here was she, a Japanese woman, who should by all logic fear and resent any American, instead risking everything to save one. The world had gone strange, or perhaps it had always been this way, and the war had simply stripped away the pretense. Miyako, James's voice pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to find him watching her with that intense gaze she was beginning to recognize. When I'm well enough, I'm going to find a way to repay you. I don't know how yet, but I will. You owe me nothing, she said. You did not ask me to help, I chose. That's exactly why I owe you. Because you chose when you didn't have to, when it made no sense to, when it put you in danger. He paused. My mama used to say there's debts you can pay with money and debts you pay with your life. This is the second kind. Then repay me by living, she said finally. Get strong, heal, return to your life. That is payment enough. James nodded slowly. Deal. That night, as Miyako lay beside him, sharing warmth as had become their routine, she thought about what returning to his life would actually mean. Would he go back to the segregated unit, to the commanders who wouldn't believe him, to the soldiers who'd nearly killed him? But those were questions for later. For now, the wound was healing. The fever was dropping, and against all odds, James Washington was alive. On the seventh day, James noticed the cloth bag. Miyako was cleaning his uniform when the personal effects bag fell out of an inner pocket. Careful with that, James said, his voice stronger now. It's important. Miyako picked it up, feeling its light weight. What is inside? Open it. She untied the cord carefully. Inside were small glass vials. But when she opened one and smelled it, the scent was unexpected. Cinnamon. Another held something darker, more pungent. Another smelled sweet and complex. Spices. There were also folded pieces of paper. She pulled one out carefully. It was an index card covered in neat handwriting. At the top, Mama Ruth's buttermilk biscuits, Sunday best. Below, a list of ingredients and instructions written with obvious care. She looked at James, confused. You saved recipes and spices. He was watching her intently. I was a mess sergeant before they reassigned me to combat infantry. Fed 200 men 3 meals a day in France. When they transferred me here, I thought maybe I could cook again. Brought my mama's recipes, my sister Marie's, ones I learned myself. Miyako pulled out another card. Field hand lunch. Another Sunday pot roast. Another Marie's wedding cake someday. Each one carefully preserved, carried across an ocean, saved even when running for his life. This is culture, she said softly. This is art. James looked surprised. You understand that? I was told Americans have no culture, only violence and ugliness. She held up the recipe cards. But this is love written down. This is memory. This is everything propaganda said you were not. Something shifted in James's expression. What did they tell you exactly? Miyako hesitated. Then she pulled out her own notebook from the shelf. Her propaganda translations. She opened to a random page and read aloud in English. Americans are barbarians who know only destruction. They have no history, no tradition, no beauty. They consume everything and create nothing. The words hung in the small room. Words she had written, words she had believed. I translated enemy broadcasts, she continued quietly, for 3 years. I turned your promises into proof of your lies. She looked at him. And then I found you dying in the snow, and you asked about kitchen supplies, and you carried recipes, and everything I was taught became complicated. James was quiet for a long moment. What did they teach us about Japanese people? What did they say? That y'all were fanatics, couldn't be reasoned with, would rather die than surrender? He met her eyes. Then you saved my life. So I guess we both carried lies that kept us alive until truth could survive. They sat with that understanding between them. Two people raised to hate each other, taught their entire lives that the other side was less than human, now bound together by one choice made in snow and desperation. I want to show you something, James said suddenly. When I'm stronger, when I can stand long enough, I want to cook for you, real Southern cooking, the kind my mama made. Miyako started to protest. He could barely sit up, but James interrupted. You said Americans got no culture. I want to show you what we do have. It's in the recipes my mama taught me, in every meal that says you matter enough to feed well. That's our art. And I owe you at least one good meal. You owe me nothing, Miyako repeated. I know, that's why I want to do it anyway. The nightmare came on the ninth night. Miyako woke to James thrashing beside her, his body rigid, words pouring out in a desperate stream. He was somewhere else reliving some battle. His hands fought invisible enemies. James, Miyako whispered urgently, shaking his shoulder. James, wake up. You are safe. But he was trapped in whatever hell he was reliving. His elbow caught her shoulder. She tried again, speaking more firmly, switching to Japanese, in hopes the unfamiliar language might jar him awake. Finally, his eyes opened. For a moment, he didn't recognize her, and she saw something frightening. A readiness for violence born of too many times needing to fight or die. Then awareness returned. Horror replaced the blankness. Did I hurt you? No, you had a bad dream. I could have hurt you. He moved away from her. This is why you should have let me sleep apart. You need the warmth, Miyako said practically. And you did not hurt me. They sat in silence for a while. Finally, James spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. I killed a man in France. Close combat. No gun, just hands and a knife. He was maybe 18. Had blonde hair. I see him sometimes when I close my eyes. Miyako thought carefully before responding. The war asked impossible things of everyone. Made us all into people we did not want to be. What impossible things did it ask of you? She hadn't talked about it, not to anyone. But something in this moment in the darkness and honesty loosened her tongue. I watched my mother die and could not help her. The pneumonia came in winter. No medicine, no doctor who would come. I held her while she drowned in her own lungs. She felt the old pain rising. Before she died, she begged me for water. We had none. The pipes were frozen. I left her to find some. When I returned, she was gone. Her voice broke on the last word. James's hand found hers in the darkness. She died alone because I left, Miyako continued. I know this is foolish. I know she was dying anyway. But I see her face asking for water I could not provide. That wasn't your fault. Your young soldier was not yours either. You fought for your life. That is what war is. Doesn't make it easier. No, Miyako agreed. It does not. They lay back down, but sleep was elusive. Instead, they talked through the remaining hours of darkness. James told her about Georgia, about the complicated beauty of a place that held both wonder and cruelty, about fishing in streams with his sister, about the way the air smelled after summer rain. Miyako told him about Tokyo before the bombs, about the festivals and the theaters, about her father taking her to see American movies and explaining the cultural differences. As dawn approached, James said, I can't stay here forever. You know that. I know. If I go back to my unit, best case, I get court-martialed for being AWOL. Worst case, the guys who did this find a way to finish it. Is there no one you can trust? James considered. Sergeant Marcus Davis. He's black, been in longer than most. If anyone could help me navigate this, it's him. Then we must reach him. How I can't exactly walk into the depot without being spotted. Miyako was quiet, thinking. Then, I will go. I will find this Sergeant Davis and bring him message from you. That's too dangerous. More dangerous than pulling dying soldier through snow. She met his eyes. I have survived impossible things, James Washington. I can do this one more. He started to argue, then seemed to realize the futility. You're stubborn, you know that. Yes, this is why you are still alive. James pulled a scrap of paper from his belongings and began writing carefully. Give this to Davis, nobody else. Miyako took the paper. The message was brief, written in code. Davis, it's Washington. Old friend needs help. Rules still apply. Come when safe. That night, Miyako barely slept, rehearsing what she'd say, how she'd find Davis, what she'd do if things went wrong. James lay beside her, also sleepless, both aware that tomorrow would determine whether his survival continued or ended. You've done so much already, James said in the darkness. More than anyone had a right to expect. You would do the same, Miyako replied. I'd like to think so, but I don't know if I'd have the courage. Courage is not absence of fear, Miyako said. It is acting despite fear. We are both afraid. We both act anyway. That is enough. James's hand found hers, squeezed gently. When this is over, when I'm home, I'm going to remember this. Going to remember you. And I'm going to be the kind of man who deserves what you gave me. You already are, Miyako said softly. You were that man when I found you. That is why I helped. In the morning, she would go to the supply depot. She would risk everything one more time for a man who, by all the logic of war and nations, she should have left to die in the snow. But logic had nothing to do with it anymore. Somewhere in the space between enemy and friend, between propaganda and truth, Miyako Tanaka had found the person she wanted to be. And that person didn't leave dying men in the snow. That person understood that the most radical act in a world gone mad was simple human kindness. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, but tonight they were warm, they were alive, and they were proof that everything both sides had been taught was incomplete. The supply depot sprawled along the waterfront like a small city of corrugated metal and canvas. Miyako approached nervously just after dawn when civilian workers streamed through the gates. The harbor smelled of diesel fuel and sea salt. She'd rehearsed her cover story a dozen times. English teacher seeking work, translator position, anything that would give her reason to wander looking for one specific man among hundreds. In her sleeve, James's message felt like it was burning through fabric. If she were caught, the consequences would ripple back to that tiny room where James waited. She started her search, systematically moving between warehouses. "Excuse me, I am looking for translation work. Do you know where I might inquire?" Each time she scanned faces looking for the description James had given her. Tall man, dark-skinned, sergeant stripes, crescent scar on his left hand. After 20 anxious minutes, she saw him. A man matching the description stood at the end of a dock, clipboard in hand, directing workers. When he gestured, the movement exposed his left hand. There, a long white scar curved like a moon's edge. Miyako approached carefully, waiting until he was alone. "Excuse me, Sergeant. May I speak to you, please?" He turned, studying her with the practiced assessment of someone who'd survived war by reading situations quickly. "Ma'am, you need something." She hesitated, scanning for nearby ears. They were relatively alone. Still, she lowered her voice. "I have message from a friend, an American." His expression didn't change, but something sharpened in his eyes. "What friend?" Miyako glanced around once more, then said quietly, "He say his name is James Washington." The change was immediate. Marcus Davis's eyes widened, his professional mask cracking. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "What did you just say?" "James Washington. He is alive. He asked me bring this to you." She slipped the folded paper from her sleeve, but didn't hand it over yet. Davis looked at the paper, then at her face, then around the depot. When he spoke again, his voice carried layers of shock and desperate hope. "Where is he?" "You tell me right now, ma'am." "You read first," Miyako insisted, offering the paper. Davis took it, unfolding it quickly. His eyes scanned the brief message. She watched his face carefully. She saw his jaw tighten, his eyes close briefly, his shoulders drop, as if releasing months of held tension. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. "I thought he was dead. They told us he deserted. Some said he attacked white soldiers. I knew none of it was right, but I couldn't prove anything." He looked at Miyako with new intensity. "Where is he?" "He is safe, but not strong yet. He say you are friend. He trusts you." Davis nodded slowly, still processing. "How bad is he hurt?" "Very bad, but healing. He cannot stay hidden much longer." "No, he can't." Davis looked around again, calculating. "MPs are still looking. They think he's either dead or deserted. But I know what really happened." His voice hardened. "Some white soldiers didn't like him volunteering to cook for an integrated unit. Thought he was getting above himself. They jumped him near the docks. Beat him with kitchen tools. I found blood but no body. Assumed the worst." Miyako absorbed this, her understanding becoming clearer and more dangerous. "He say you can help. Can you?" "I can try, but we got to be smart about this. If I just bring him in, questions get asked. The soldiers who did it, they got friends in the MP Corps." Davis thought for a moment. "Tell him to hold tight. 2 days. I'll figure out a way to get him back without it becoming a thing. 2 days, then I'll come to wherever he's hiding." 2 days, Miyako confirmed. "How do I find him?" She gave him the address, carefully made him repeat it twice. Then added, 3 knocks pause, 2 knocks more. This is signal he used in France, yes." Davis's eyebrows rose. "He told you about that." "He tell me many things when fever was high." Something shifted in Davis's expression, a mixture of respect and curiosity. Ma'am, I don't know who you are or why you helped him, but you just saved a good man's life. Maybe the best man I served with. He paused. What's your name? Miyako Tanaka. Miss Tanaka, thank you. I mean that. He glanced around once more. 2 days, and Miss Tanaka, be careful. The people who did this, they don't want him found alive. Miyako bowed slightly. I understand. 2 days. She walked away, forcing herself to maintain a steady pace to blend into the stream of workers. Only when she was 3 blocks away did she allow herself to lean against a wall, her legs suddenly weak, her hands trembling. She'd done it. Found Davis. Set in motion whatever would happen next. When Miyako returned to the boarding house, she found James sitting up for the first time, his back against the wall, looking stronger but still gaunt. Well, he asked as soon as she entered. I found him. Sergeant Davis. He say 2 days, then he come. James's whole body seemed to relax. You actually found him, and he believed you. I think your message convinced him, and he say you are good man, best man he served with. Something complicated crossed James's face. Pride mixed with something heavier. Davis is a good judge of character. He say you were attacked by white soldiers with kitchen tools because you volunteered to cook for integrated unit. James nodded slowly. Camp was segregated. White soldiers had their mess colored, soldiers had ours. I was cooking for our unit, but the food was better, had skills. Some white officers noticed, asked if I could help train their cooks. I said yes. His jaw tightened. Some people didn't like that, thought I was getting uppity, stepping out of my place. What is uppity? Means acting like you're equal when you're supposed to know you're not. The bitterness in his voice was sharp. 3 of them caught me after dark. Had a cast iron skillet, a meat cleaver, a rolling pin. Figured they'd teach me about staying in my lane. Miyako sat beside him, processing this. Your own soldiers did this, not enemy, your own. That's right. This is why you could not go to military police. Colored soldier accusing white soldiers, they'd find a way to make it my fault. My word don't count for much. They sat in silence. Then Miyako asked, what happened now? When Sergeant Davis come, he'll figure something out. Maybe say I was jumped by locals, wandered off confused. Given my injuries, it's believable. Davis is smart. He'll find a way. And if he cannot, James met her eyes, then I got choices to make. None of them good. That afternoon, James made an announcement that surprised her. I'm cooking tomorrow morning. Before Davis comes, I'm making you breakfast. Miyako started to protest. He could barely stand, but James interrupted. I've been planning this since day 3 when I realized I might actually live. I owe you a meal, Miyako, a real meal, the kind that shows you what American culture really is. You are still weak. I can stand long enough, and I got what I need right here. He gestured to the cloth bag with his spices and the military rations. Davis will take me away tomorrow night. This is my last chance to keep my promise. What promise? That I'd show you Americans got culture, that it lives in the way we feed each other. His voice was firm despite his weakness. You said we were barbarians with nothing beautiful. I'm going to prove that wrong. One meal at a time. Miyako wanted to argue, but she saw the determination in his face. This mattered to him beyond simple gratitude. This was about dignity, about proving something not just to her, but to himself. What will you cook? She asked finally. Bacon and coffee. Ain't much, but it's what I got. Back home, there'd be biscuits and eggs and grits, but bacon and coffee is enough to make a point. He pulled out the 2 wax paper packages from the medical kit Miyako had found that first night. Inside, carefully wrapped, were 3 strips of bacon, also a small packet of ground coffee. Precious supplies he'd been saving for exactly this purpose. You kept these, Miyako said, realizing. All this time, even when you were dying. Told you. Cooking ain't just about feeding the body. It's about feeding the soul. And you saved my soul. Least I can do is feed yours. That night, as they lay together in the darkness, Miyako found herself thinking about the complexity of what the next day would bring. James would cook, Davis would come, James would leave, and she would return to her small existence alone. But something had changed. Some wall in her mind built by propaganda and war had cracked. She'd believed Americans were barbaric, cultureless, destructive. Then she'd met a man who'd nearly died protecting recipes, who'd carried spices across an ocean, who'd insisted on cooking breakfast as payment for his life being saved. If that wasn't culture, she didn't know what was. The pre-dawn cold bit at the room as James insisted on standing. Miyako helped him rise, supporting his weight until he found his balance. He moved slowly to the small brazier. "Get that last bit of coal burning good," he instructed. "We need steady heat." Miyako fed the brazier, carefully coaxing the coals to life. James pulled out the bacon strips, examining them with the eye of someone who'd cooked thousands of meals. "These ain't fresh, but they'll do. Bacon's forgiving that way." He found a flat metal pan, something Miyako used for heating rice. "This'll work." He laid the strips carefully on the cold pan, then positioned it over the brazier heat. Within moments, the most extraordinary smell began to fill the tiny room. Miyako had eaten meat perhaps twice in the past year. The scent of bacon fat, rendering the sizzle and pop of it cooking, hit her like a physical force. Her stomach contracted so hard it hurt. James noticed. "Just wait. Best part's coming." He tended the bacon with obvious expertise, turning the strips with chopsticks. His movements were economical, practiced. Even weakened by injury and days in bed, his hands moved with the grace of someone who'd spent years perfecting this simple task. "See how the fat renders out," he said softly. "That's where the flavor lives. In the fat. Americans, we don't fear it. We celebrate it. Because fat is life. Fat is survival. Fat is what kept my ancestors alive when they had nothing else." The bacon sizzled. The smell intensified. Miyako found tears in her eyes. James moved the bacon to the side, keeping it warm. Then he added water to the coffee grounds in the small pot she used for tea, set it to heat on the brazier edge. "Coffee ain't traditionally Southern, but it's American. We adopted it, made it ours. Drink it black and strong." The coffee began to brew, adding its bitter, rich scent to the bacon's smoke. The two smells intertwined in the small room, creating something that felt almost sacred. Finally, James plated the bacon. 3 strips split between 2 small dishes. Poured coffee into 2 cups. His hands shook slightly, his strength clearly fading, but he finished the task. He looked at the simple meal. 2 dishes, bacon and coffee. Nothing else. "Ain't much," he said quietly. "Back home, Mama would be ashamed to serve so little. But it's honest, it's real, and it's made with everything I got left to give." Miyako looked at the food. Steam rose from the coffee. Fat glistened on the bacon. It was the most beautiful meal she'd ever seen. "Eat," James said, sitting down heavily, "before it gets cold." Miyako picked up a piece of bacon with her chopsticks. It was still hot, the fat crispy at the edges, soft in the middle. She brought it to her mouth. The first bite exploded across her tongue. Salt and smoke and fat and something indefinable. Richness, complexity, abundance made solid and edible. Tears fell. She couldn't stop them. They came from some deep place, some reservoir of hunger and pain and survival that she'd been holding back for months, maybe years. The taste wasn't just food. It was proof that good things still existed. That beauty could be simple. That care could be expressed through something as basic as cooked meat. "It's okay," James said softly, his own eyes wet. "First real food after starving, it hits different." Miyako took another bite, chewing slowly, letting the flavors fill her mouth. She'd been told Americans had no refinement, no subtlety, but this simple preparation revealed an understanding of flavor that was profound in its directness. She sipped the coffee. Bitter and strong, it cut through the bacon's richness perfectly. The two tastes, balanced, complemented, completed each other. "In Japan," she said finally, her voice thick, "we say itadakimasu before eating. It means I humbly receive. It honors the life that died to feed us, the hands that prepared it." "We say grace," James replied. "Thank the Lord for providing. Thank Him for the hands that cooked. For the company we share." He looked at her. Same thing, really, just different words. They ate slowly, savoring every bite, making the small meal last as long as possible. Miyako felt warmth spreading through her, not just from the food, but from something else. Some understanding clicking into place. "Everything they taught me was lies," she said finally. "Not Not lies exactly, more like incomplete stories. Enemies always tell incomplete stories about each other. Makes it easier to fight. What did they teach you about Japanese people? That y'all were fanatics, would die before surrendering, that you'd been brainwashed to see Americans as demons. He drank his coffee. Then you saved my life. Fed me, hid me, protected me, and I learned that propaganda always leaves out the most important parts. What parts? The human parts. The parts that make us recognize each other. The parts that let us sit together eating bacon and understand we're not that different. Miyako finished her portion, unwilling to waste a single drop. This is culture, she said. This is what they said you did not have. Yeah, we got plenty of culture, just not always the kind that looks impressive from outside. Our culture is in kitchens, in churches, in the way we gather and feed each other and sing together and survive together. James smiled slightly. That's the culture they don't teach in schools. The culture that lives in ordinary people doing ordinary things with extraordinary love. They sat in comfortable silence as dawn light grew stronger through the paper screen. The bacon was gone, the coffee finished, but the warmth remained. Thank you, Miyako said, for this meal, for keeping your promise. Thank you for giving me the chance to keep it. James looked around the tiny room. I won't forget this, any of this. When I get home, when I'm back in Georgia, I'm going to remember a room in Yokohama where a woman I was taught to hate showed me what humanity actually means. And I will remember the man who taught me that the deepest truths are shared at tables, not podiums. The moment was broken by a sound outside, footsteps in the hall, 3 knocks on the door, a pause, 2 more knocks. Davis had come. James struggled to stand. Miyako helped him, supporting his weight as she opened the door. Sergeant Marcus Davis stood there in civilian clothes, his face carefully neutral until he saw James. Then emotion broke through. Lord Jimmy, you look like death warmed over. Feel better than I look, James replied, managing a weak smile. Thanks for coming. Davis stepped inside, closing the door quickly. His eyes swept the tiny room, taking in the details. The makeshift bandages, the empty bacon pan, the 2 coffee cups. He looked at Miyako with something like awe. Ma'am, I don't know your whole story, but what you did here is beyond brave. He turned to James. We gotta move fast. I brought civilian clothes. Got a supply truck leaving at dawn. You'll be hidden in back. Once we're there, I report you found wandering, confused from head trauma. Given your injuries, it'll sell you. What about the soldiers who did this? James asked. They got transferred out 2 days ago, probably to keep them away before questions got asked. They're someone else's problem now. You come back, you're just another wounded soldier recovering. Story is you were attacked by locals during an unauthorized patrol. You got separated, took a bad knock to the head, wanderer confused for 2 weeks. That'll work. It'll have to. Your wounds are real, your confusion was real. Everything else is filling in blanks. Davis looked at James seriously. But you gotta sell it. Can't talk about what really happened. Ever. Those soldiers got friends. This stays buried or it gets worse. James's jaw tightened, but he nodded. I understand. Davis pulled civilian clothes from his bag, pants, shirt, jacket, all worn but clean. Change quick. We got maybe 20 minutes. As James struggled into the clothes, Miyako felt the finality settling in. He was leaving. Right now. No long goodbyes. James finished dressing, looking more like a civilian now. He turned to Miyako, and for a moment neither knew what to say. I'm going to write you, James said finally. Soon as I can. And Miyako, that promise I made about cooking for you, that was just the down payment. When things settle, when the world makes sense again, I'm going to find a way to do more. To really show you what American cooking can be, what American life can be. The breakfast was enough, Miyako said, but her voice cracked. That was the down payment. The rest comes in installments over a lifetime. Davis cleared his throat. We gotta go. James nodded. He looked around the tiny room one last time. Then impulsively, he pulled the cloth bag of recipes from his jacket. Keep these, practice the recipes. When we see each other again, you cook for me. Deal. Miyako took the bag, holding it like the sacred object it was. Deal. Davis opened the door, checked the hallway. Clear. He gestured for James to follow. James moved to the door, then paused, looking back at Miyako one last time. You showed me Japan's humanity. he said quietly. I'll spend the rest of my life showing you America's. That's a promise. Then he was gone, Davis supporting his weight as they disappeared down the hallway. Miyako stood in her doorway watching until they vanished. She listened to the front door open and close, listened to silence return. The room felt enormous now, empty in a way it hadn't been even before James arrived. Miyako closed the door slowly and turned to face the space. The bacon pan still held a trace of grease. The coffee cups sat side by side on her small table. The cloth bag of recipes sat on her table cards, spread out where she'd been studying them. Physical proof that the last 2 weeks had been real. She picked up the bag, opened it carefully, pulled out the recipe cards one by one. Mama Ruth's buttermilk biscuits, field hand lunch, Sunday pot roast, Marie's wedding cake, each one written in neat handwriting stained with use and care. She held them to her chest and allowed herself to cry. Not from sadness exactly, from something more complicated, from the weight of having survived something impossible, from understanding that she'd been changed in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. Eventually she composed herself, put the recipe cards back carefully, made herself tea on the brazier that still held the scent of bacon and coffee. But some things couldn't be erased. The smell would linger for days. The memory would last forever. And tucked in her pocket, she carried the address James had whispered as he left. An address in Georgia, a place called Monroe County, a farm that didn't exist yet but would. Write to me there, he'd said, in 6 months, in a year, whenever you can. Let me know you're okay, and I'll write back. Maybe if fate allows, someday you'll see it yourself. It seemed impossible. A Japanese woman traveling to America, to the segregated South, to a black man's farm. Every part of it violated some rule, some boundary, some accepted truth. But then again, everything about the last 2 weeks had been impossible. Miyako finished her tea, washed the dishes carefully, saving the bacon grease in a small container. Even that small amount was precious. Waste nothing. Survive everything. That had been her motto since the war ended. But now she had a new one, whispered by a man who'd cooked breakfast with his last strength. The deepest truths are shared at tables, not podiums. She would remember that. Would practice his mama's recipes when she could afford ingredients. Would teach her students not just English words, but the truth she'd learned, that humanity transcends propaganda, that kindness crosses every border. Outside, the sun rose over Yokohama's ruins. Another day. Another chance to survive. But now survival meant something different. Now it meant living in a way that honored what James had taught her. Now it meant becoming a bridge between worlds that war had torn apart. Miyako Tanaka stood at her window, watching morning light illuminate the broken city that was slowly and possibly beginning to heal. And she smiled, because she'd learned the most important truth: breakfast can change the world. One meal, one moment, one impossible act of human connection at a time. The bacon was gone. The coffee was finished. But the warmth would endure. The first letter arrived 3 weeks later, delivered by a young boy who ran errands for the American Postal Service. Miyako's hands trembled as she accepted the envelope, foreign paper with careful handwriting, addressing her in both English and Japanese characters. She waited until evening before opening it. The letter was brief, but carried the weight of continents. Miyako Sergeant Davis kept his word. I'm safe. They bought the story. Officially, I was attacked by unknown assailants, wandered confused, just recovered. My records are clean. I'll be shipping stateside next month. The doctor says my side will heal fine, though I'll carry the scar forever. A small price for being alive. I don't know if words can carry what I owe you, but one day, if fate allows, I'll see you again. Until then, keep those recipes safe. Practice them. Think of them as letters from my mama to you across all the distance and difference. With respect and gratitude. James Washington. P.S. The farm address. I told you I'm going to make it real. Count on it. Miyako read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in the cloth bag with the recipe cards. Physical proof that the impossible 2 weeks had been real. That James had survived. That somewhere across the Pacific Ocean, a man was rebuilding his life because she'd chosen to help. She pulled out Mama Ruth's biscuit recipe that night, studying the ingredients she couldn't afford. Flour, buttermilk, butter, baking powder. Simple things that were luxuries in occupation Japan, but she memorized the proportions anyway. The technique. preparing for a future when she might actually attempt it. So, over the following months, letters became their bridge. James wrote about his journey home, the long ship voyage across the Pacific, seeing San Francisco's lights after years away. His return to Georgia, to red clay and pine trees and heat that made summer feel like stepping into an oven. His mama's embrace, his sister Marie's tears. The slow process of healing both body and spirit. Miyako wrote back about Yokohama's gradual resurrection. Buildings rising from rubble. Her English school expanding. The way she taught not just language but culture, now explaining American customs through the lens of what James had taught her. She sent pressed cherry blossom petals when spring came. Beauty that exists because it's temporary, she wrote, like the snow that brought us together. James responded with pressed pine needles. These last forever, he wrote, tougher than they look, like you. In 1905, photographs began arriving, James standing in front of a small frame house, its porch sagging but proud. Fields stretching behind him, red earth dotted with young cotton plants. A family portrait with his mother Ruth and sister Marie. The house was modest, the fields raw, but the pride in the images was unmistakable. 10 acres, he wrote, bought on credit. Bank grumbled about lending to a colored veteran, but Davis wrote letters. His white commanding officer did too. Sometimes the system works if you push hard enough. Your map is framed on my wall, the one you drew that night. Looking at it reminds me that impossible things happen when people choose kindness over fear. Miyako's school continued growing. She took a position translating occupation manuals for local schools, the pay double her tutoring fees. For the first time since before the war, she had enough to eat regularly, could save a little, dream beyond mere survival. Her teaching evolved. She began incorporating American food culture into language lessons. Students learned vocabulary through recipes. They practiced conversations about cooking, about sharing meals. The principal questioned her methods until test scores showed students retaining vocabulary at twice the normal rate. Turns out children remember words better when they're attached to tastes and smells and the promise of eventual feasts. Mrs. Garrett passed away that spring peacefully in her sleep. At the small funeral, the old woman's daughter gave Miyako a note found in her mother's belongings. I knew. The increased water. The careful silence. I'm glad I said nothing. Some rules deserve breaking. Some kindness deserves protection. Miyako wept reading it, understanding that she'd never been as alone in that risk as she'd thought. By 1950, James's letters described expansion. 15 acres now, cotton yields strong enough that neighbors who'd been skeptical were buying his seed. He'd hired workers paying fair wages in both cash and profit shares. Marcus works with me now, he wrote. Took his discharge, came to Georgia, brought his family. We're building something here. Not just a farm, a model. Proof that men can work together regardless of what the law says about where they're supposed to sit on buses. We eat lunch together every day. Black workers and white workers at the same table. Some folks don't like it. Some folks like it more than they'll admit. Change comes slow, but it comes. That same year brought new possibilities. Korean War created demand for teachers who could bridge American and Asian cultures. Miyako applied for a cultural exchange position teaching Japanese to military families. The application asked about her qualifications. She wrote, honestly, I learned American culture from a soldier who cooked me breakfast when we were both supposed to be enemies. Everything I teach comes from understanding that humanity transcends the boundaries we're told matter. The approval came swiftly. 6-month position in California with possibility of extension. Visa granted for cultural education purposes. Miyako stood in her small apartment, holding the visa papers. 7 years since that night in the snow. 7 years of letters and recipes and slow building of something neither of them had words for. She wrote to James, I'm coming to America. Not to Georgia yet. To California first. But the same country. The same impossible dream getting closer to real. His response arrived 2 weeks later, faster than usual. Come to Georgia after California. Mama wants to meet you. Marie wants to meet you. I want you to see what we built, what you made possible. Rooms ready, guest or permanent, your choice. But come, please come. July 1952, Miyako stepped off a Greyhound bus in Monroe County, Georgia, her single suitcase containing everything she'd brought to America. The California position had gone well enough to secure permanent residency. Now she was here in the Deep South, in the heart of everything America promised and struggled to become. The heat hit her like a physical wall. Air so thick with humidity you could almost drink it. The smell of pine and red clay and something green and growing. James waited by a pickup truck, broader than in photographs, his face weathered by sun and work. When their eyes met, 7 years collapsed into nothing. They didn't embrace, not in public. Not in 1952 Georgia, where such things could get people killed. But their hand clasp lasted long enough to say everything words couldn't. Miyako Tanaka, he said, voice rough with emotion. James Washington farmer now. Come on, Mama's waiting, and she's been cooking for 3 days straight. The drive took 20 minutes through countryside that seemed impossibly vast after Japan's dense cities. Fields stretched to horizons. Pine forests stood tall and ancient. The sky felt bigger somehow. James's house appeared around a bend. Larger than in photos, fresh white paint gleaming. The porch had been rebuilt sturdy now with a swing that moved gently in the breeze. Behind it, fields of cotton stretched in neat rows. A barn stood to one side. Everything spoke of work and care and stubborn determination. Before the truck fully stopped, the front door opened. Ruth Washington emerged, apron dusted with flower arms already spreading wide. You the one, save my boy, she said, her voice carrying the weight of a mother's gratitude. Come here, child. The embrace was fierce and warm and smelled of biscuits baking. When Ruth pulled back, her eyes were wet. Bless you for giving him back to me. Marie appeared next, tall like her brother, her face open and kind. Miss Miyako, we've heard so much. Jimmy reads your letters out loud at Sunday dinner. Feels like we already know you. Inside the house was modest but immaculate. Wood floors polished to a shine. Simple furniture built to last. And in the kitchen, a sight that made Miyako's breath catch. The table was laden with food. Fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread, biscuits, sweet tea in a sweating pitcher, black-eyed peas, peach cobbler cooling on the counter. A feast, an offering, a welcome made tangible through the language James had taught her to recognize. This is too much, Miyako protested. Ain't nearly enough, Ruth replied firmly. You gave me my son back. This is just a start on repaying that debt. They sat, the four of them, around a table that creaked under the weight of plenty. Ruth said grace, thanking the Lord for bringing them together, for preserving James, for allowing Miyako safe passage. Then they ate. The fried chicken was revelation. Crispy coating giving way to tender meat. The collards were complex, smoky, with a tang that made her want more. The biscuits, when Miyako bit into one, transported her back to that tiny room, to James's promise that this was just the beginning. These are your recipe, she said to Ruth, tears threatening, from the card James carried. Ruth's eyes widened. He gave you my recipe cards. He said they were letters from you to me, across distance and difference. Something shifted in Ruth's expression. She reached across the table, taking Miyako's hand. Then your family. Anyone Jimmy trusts with my recipes is family. That's how it works in this house. After dinner, James showed Miyako the farm. They walked the fields as evening cooled the brutal heat. He explained crop rotation, soil management, the economics of small farming in a region designed to keep black farmers dependent. I own this, he said, gesturing to the land. Deeds got my name. First Washington to own land since my great-grandfather was freed. That's because of you. This is because of your work, your determination. My work was only possible because you gave me a second chance at life. Everything here grows from that choice you made in the snow. They reached a small grove of pines James had planted. Young trees, but growing strong. One for every month you kept me alive, he explained. 14 trees. They'll outlive both of us. That evening, sitting on the rebuilt porch swing, James told her about the challenges. The hostile looks in town, the banks that still wouldn't lend regardless of credit, the constant navigation of segregation's labyrinth. The neighbors who saw his success as threat rather than inspiration. But some things are changing, he added. Marcus and I employ both black and white workers, pay the same wages, eat lunch together. That's radical here. But it works. People see it works. Their children play together while their parents work side by side. Maybe that's how change happens. Not through laws first, but through living the change until laws have to catch up. You are building the world you want to see, Miyako observed. We are. Yumi, Marcus, everyone here. We're building proof that people can see past difference when they share purpose, when they break bread together. The next morning, Miyako woke in the guest room James had prepared. Simple but comfortable. Through the window, she could see fields and forest and sky. So much space. So much possibility. She found Ruth in the kitchen, already preparing breakfast. The older woman handed her an apron without asking. You know how to make biscuits from Jimmy's teaching. Only in theory, never had ingredients to practice. Then today you learn for real. Come on, child. Can't have you knowing the recipe without knowing the feel. For the next hour, Ruth taught her the tactile knowledge that no written recipe could convey. How the dough should feel when it's right. The specific resistance it should offer when folded. The sound the buttermilk makes when incorporated properly. The way you cut biscuits to ensure they rise evenly. Cooking ain't just following instructions, Ruth explained as they worked. It's understanding, it's feel, it's love made edible. You can follow a recipe perfect and make terrible food if you don't cook with your heart. When the biscuits emerged from the oven, golden and perfect, Ruth had Miyako taste one while still steaming hot. The flavor was everything the bacon had promised 7 years ago. Buttery, flaky, substantial. Culture in bread form. You got the touch, Ruth declared. Now you can make these anywhere. Carry a piece of us wherever you go. Over the following weeks, Miyako settled into a rhythm. She taught him English to local families, both black and white, who wanted their children to have broader opportunities. She cooked with Ruth, learning recipes that went back generations. She walked the fields with James, understanding the practical reality of turning land into livelihood. And she saw the quiet resistance they were staging. The integrated workforce, the fair wages, the shared meals that violated every social convention of the segregated South. It wasn't loud, it wasn't confrontational, but it was real tangible proof that another way was possible. One Saturday evening, a car pulled up. A white man in his 40s emerged well-dressed, carrying himself with authority. Miyako tensed, but James seemed unsurprised. That's William Sullivan, he said quietly. Banker. His wife Dorothy has been bringing their children to your English lessons. Sullivan approached the porch where they sat. He removed his hat, nodded politely. Washington, Miss Tanaka. Mr. Sullivan, James replied, his voice carefully neutral. I won't take much of your time. I wanted to say Dorothy showed me what your teaching is doing for our children. The test scores, the confidence, the way they're learning not just language, but thinking. He paused, clearly uncomfortable but determined. I was skeptical about integrated teaching, about a lot of things, but results speak louder than my prejudices. He pulled an envelope from his jacket. This is a letter of credit, for expansion if you want it. Favorable terms, Dorothy insisted. Said if we claim to believe in meritocracy, we better put money where our mouths are. James took the envelope, slowly studying Sullivan's face. This isn't charity. It's investment. Your farm's profitable. Your model works. That matters more than other considerations. Sullivan met James's eyes. I'm not saying I've figured everything out. I'm saying I'm willing to admit when I'm wrong. Dorothy's better at that than me, but I'm learning. After Sullivan left, James sat silently for a long moment, holding the letter of credit. Miyako waited, letting him process. 7 years ago, I was bleeding in snow, left for dead by my own countrymen, he finally said. Today, a white banker just offered me fair credit. Sullivan's here because Dorothy saw children learning together. And Dorothy looked because her son came home happy. Small choices ripple. That breakfast we shared rippled all the way here. It is work, Miyako replied. Your work, Ruth's work, Marcus's work, everyone here choosing to live differently until different becomes normal. Maybe, James allowed, but it started somewhere, with one choice, one breakfast, one moment of believing better was possible. By 1954, the school had formalized. Yamamoto Washington Academy named for both of them over Miyako's protests. The building was modest, but it had a proper kitchen at its center. Students cooked while learning, measured ingredients while mastering fractions, followed recipes while practicing reading comprehension. Shared meals while building friendships that crossed every line the adult world had drawn. The first class had 30 students evenly split between black and white families. By the second year, enrollment hit 80 with waiting lists. They come for the test scores, James observed, watching children laugh together during a cooking lesson. They stay because their kids are happy, because learning feels like joy instead of duty. But success brought attention, and attention brought conflict. One spring morning in 1955, Miyako arrived at the school to find a message burned into the grass. 3 words, "Go home, Jap." She stood looking at the scorched earth, feeling the weight of old hatreds refusing to die. James appeared beside her and Marcus, with him both men's faces set hard. "Sheriff Briggs," Marcus said quietly, "or his boys. Same families who burned crosses when we started hiring integrated crews." "What do we do?" Miyako asked. James knelt, running his hand through the burned grass. Then he stood, decision made. "We plant, right here. Herb garden, basil, thyme, rosemary, for the kitchen, for student cooking projects." He looked at Miyako. "Someone tried to destroy. We grow instead. That's how we answer hate." By the time students arrived an hour later, all 3 of them were on their knees planting herbs in the scorched earth. The children joined without being asked, understanding instinctively that this was important. That growing things where hate had been was itself an act of defiance. By week's end, the herb garden flourished. Students tended it daily, harvesting for cooking lessons. The burned message was replaced by green abundance. But the harassment continued. Anonymous letters, threatening phone calls. Once someone slashed the truck's tires. The message was clear. Integrated education threatened people who needed separation to maintain their sense of superiority. "We could stop," Miyako said one evening after another threatening letter arrived. "Make the school single race, end the conflict." "We could," James agreed. "But then, what did we build? Another place that accepts the world as it is instead of working toward the world it should be." He took her hand. "You didn't leave me to die in snow because it was convenient. You saved me because it was right. We don't stop now because it's hard. We keep going because it's right." So they continued. And slowly, grudgingly, the community shifted. Parents saw children thriving, saw test scores rising, saw friendships forming that should have been impossible according to the old rules. Economic success spoke louder than ideology. James's farm prospered. Marcus's family built a house. The academy's graduates got scholarships, got jobs, got futures that had been closed to previous generations. By 1957, opposition had quieted, if not disappeared. The academy was established fact. The integrated workforce normalized. The shared meals unremarkable. What had been radical became routine. That July, James and Miyako married on the porch where they'd first talked about recipes and culture and the possibility of different futures. Ruth presided, reading verses about love and faithfulness. Marie sang, her voice soaring over pine trees and cotton fields. Students formed a circle around them, holding hands across every divide that was supposed to matter. The ceremony wasn't legal. Interracial marriage remained criminal in Georgia. But they married anyway in every way that mattered before everyone who mattered. The paperwork could wait for laws to catch up with justice. "I told you I'd repay the debt," James said, as they stood on that porch holding hands, making promises. "Told you I'd show you what America could be. This is it. Not perfect, not finished, but real. Built on the foundation you laid when you chose kindness over fear." "We built this," Miyako corrected, "together, with Ruth and Marie and Marcus and every student who chose to learn instead of hate. This is what happens when people decide the old ways don't have to be the only ways." The celebration lasted into evening. Food covered every surface, recipes from Ruth's family and Miyako's memory and students' diverse backgrounds. Southern fried chicken next to Japanese onigiri, collard greens beside sukimono pickles, peach cobbler and mochi sharing space on the dessert table. A feast that represented not fusion, but conversation. Different traditions respecting each other enough to share the table. As fireflies began their evening dance and children chased each other through fields that represented impossible dreams, made real, James and Miyako sat on the porch swing. The same swing where they'd first talked about change and courage. "You remember what you said that morning?" James asked. "When I cooked bacon in your room, I said many things. You said Americans had no culture, that we were barbarians. I was wrong. No, you were incomplete. Same as I was incomplete about Japanese people. We both learned that culture lives in unexpected places, that humanity is bigger than any story we're told about enemies. He gestured to the celebration around them, to the children laughing, to the tables laden with food from two worlds. This is culture. People from different backgrounds choosing to build something together. That's the most American thing there is, when we live up to our promises instead of our prejudices. Miyako leaned against him, watching their community, their family, their impossible creation thriving in the Georgia evening. From snow to soil, she said softly. From enemy to family. From one breakfast to 1,000 shared meals. This is what warmth becomes when you feed it instead of fear it. This is what happens, James agreed, when someone chooses to save a dying man instead of walking away. When someone sees a human being instead of a uniform or skin color or propaganda. Everything here grew from that choice. The fireflies danced, children laughed, adults who'd been raised to hate each other shared food and stories and space. And on a porch in Georgia, two people who should have been enemies by every rule of war and race and nation sat together watching the world they'd built from nothing but kindness and stubborn hope. The bacon breakfast had been just the beginning. All of this was what happened when that breakfast lesson took root and grew. When culture recognized culture. When humanity chose humanity. When warmth endured. The 1960s brought storms of a different kind. The world was changing, sometimes through fire. Birmingham, Selma, Memphis. The television showed cities burning, protesters beaten, leaders assassinated. The academy sat in the middle of it all, a small island of integrated learning in a sea of resistance. Some nights cars would drive slowly past the school. Sometimes there were shouts. Once a rock through the window, but the children kept coming. Black and white families kept enrolling their children because results spoke louder than threats. In 1963, federal marshals came, not to shut them down, but to document what they were doing, how it worked, whether it could be replicated. A young lawyer named Bobby Kennedy visited, spent an afternoon watching children cook together while conjugating verbs. He asked James and Miyako to consult on integration guidelines for other Southern schools. How do you make it work? Kennedy asked, watching a black girl and white girl laughing over a batch of biscuits. Feed them first, James said simply. Can't hate someone you have broken bread with. Can't fear someone who taught you their grandmother's recipe. The academy model spread, not fast, not everywhere, but school by school, kitchen by kitchen, shared meal by shared meal. By 1968, there were 7 Yamamoto Washington academies across Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. That same year, they traveled to Tokyo for the Olympics. James's first time in Japan. Miyako's first time back since 1952. They stood in Yokohama in the plaza where she'd found him dying 22 years before. The ruins had been replaced by gleaming buildings, the ash by gardens. Hard to believe this is the same place, James said quietly. It is not the same place, Miyako replied. We are not the same people. That is the point of surviving. We get to become something new. They visited the site of Mrs. Garrett's boarding house. It was an electronics shop, now bright and bustling. But James placed his hand on the wall anyway. Thank you, he whispered to the memory of a tiny room where an impossible thing had happened. The 1970s tested them in different ways. James's heart, weakened by old wounds and years of hard work, began to fail. In 1975, he collapsed in the fields during harvest. Marcus found him, drove him to the hospital in time. The doctor said his heart was damaged. Old scar tissue from the beating, from the infection, from 25 years of ignoring warning signs. He needed surgery. He needed rest. He needed to stop working 16-hour days. Can't stop, James said from his hospital bed. Too much still to build. Then build from bed, Miyako said firmly. You once told me to repay you by living. Now I tell you the same. Live, or I will be very angry. Something in her voice and her eyes reminded him of a young woman dragging him through snow with impossible strength. He smiled weakly. Yes, ma'am. The surgery saved his life, but it changed things. James couldn't work the fields anymore. Couldn't stand for hours teaching cooking classes. Had to learn a different way to build his dream. So they wrote. For the next 7 years, James and Miyako co-authored a book. They called it Snow and Pines, an impossible love in an impossible time. It told their story honestly, the racism, the occupation, the propaganda on both sides, and how one breakfast had started to change it all. The book was published in '82. It became required reading in their academy network, then in other schools, then universities. By 1980, it was translated into Japanese. Miyako's father's old colleagues at the university used it to teach about the dangers of propaganda, the power of individual choice. Ruth passed away in 1986 peacefully in her sleep. She was 93. At her funeral, over 200 former students came. Many brought dishes they'd learned to cook from her recipes. The reception looked like a Ruth Washington cookbook come to life. She taught me that cooking is love made edible, Miyako said in her eulogy. She gave me her recipes, but more than that, she gave me her heart. She made me family when the world said that was impossible. Everything good we built, she helped build. James wept openly, his head on Miyako's shoulder. The woman who'd taught him to feed his soul, who'd preserved her family's culture in recipe cards, who'd welcomed an enemy as a daughter and was gone. But her recipes lived on. In 1987, they published Ruth Washington's Kitchen Recipes and Remembrance. All proceeds went to Academy scholarships. By 1990, it had funded 300 full rides for students who couldn't otherwise afford tuition. That same year brought an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Tommy Briggs, son of the man who'd burned messages in their grass who'd terrorized them for years. But Tommy was 40 now, a lawyer, nervous. "I need to speak with you both," he said on the porch. The same porch where his father had once stood with hate in his eyes. They invited him to sit. "My father is dying," Tommy said. "Cancer. He's got maybe a month. And he asked me to come here to tell you," he paused, struggling, "to tell you he was wrong about everything. He spent 30 years being wrong, being hateful, being the kind of man who plants hate in grass. And he wants you to know before he dies that watching you succeed, watching you prove him wrong with every year, watching his own children learn from Miss Miyako and come home better people than he ever was. It changed him. Too late, too slow, but it changed him." James and Miyako looked at each other. Old pain, old anger, and something else. Something like grace. "Would he like to visit?" Miyako asked quietly. Tommy looked stunned. "You would allow that?" "We built our life on the belief that people can change," James said. "Be ashamed to stop believing that now." Sheriff Briggs came 2 weeks later in a wheelchair, oxygen tank rattling. He looked at the academy, at the herb garden his son's vandalism had created, at the children playing together. "I'm sorry," he said and wept. Old man tears, regret too heavy to carry. They fed him lunch, fried chicken and collard greens, biscuits made from Ruth's recipe. He ate slowly, tears falling into his food. "This is what I was fighting against," he said. "This beauty, this love, this proof that I was wrong about everything." He looked at them. "Thank you for showing me, even though I didn't deserve the lesson." He died 3 weeks later. At his funeral, his family asked if Miyako and James would speak. They did. They talked about grace, about change, about how it's never too late to choose differently. Tommy Briggs became one of their strongest advocates, used his law practice to help other integrated schools navigate hostile communities, eventually started the Briggs Foundation for Integrated Education, funding schools across the South. "My father spent his life planting hate," Tommy told them in 1995. "I'm spending mine planting hope. It's the least I can do." By 1990, there were 40 Yamamoto Washington academies operating in 12 states. Enrollment exceeded 10,000 students annually. The model had proven itself, survived every challenge, outlasted every critic. James was 76, Miyako was 74. Their hair had gone white, their hands had grown gnarled, but their eyes still held the light they'd found in each other in that tiny room in Yokohama half a century before. "We did it," James said one evening on the porch swing. "Built something that will outlast us." "We are doing it," Miyako corrected. "Not done yet. Still students to teach, still meals to share, still warmth to spread." James smiled, took her hand, squeezed gently. Still cold. It was their old joke. From that first dawn when he'd asked and she'd pressed closer. "Never again, my love," she answered as she always did. "Never again." James died on a May morning with dogwood blossoms drifting past the window like snow. He'd woken before dawn as he always did. Farmers' habits don't fade even when you can no longer work the fields. Miyako woke with him as she always did. 52 years together had synchronized their rhythms. "What would you like for breakfast?" she asked. "Bacon," he said, smiling. "Always bacon." She helped him to the porch swing while she cooked. The smell drifted out through the screen door, salt and smoke and fat, the same smell that had filled a tiny room in Yokohama and changed two lives forever. When she brought the plate out, James was staring at the fields at the pine grove now towering 50 feet tall, at the academy visible in the distance where early risers were already arriving. "I can see it all from here," he said quietly. "Everything we built. Everything that will keep building after we're gone." "After you rest," Miyako corrected, settling beside him with the bacon. "After I'm gone," James repeated gently. "It's okay, Mia. I'm tired. Good tired, satisfied tired. The kind of tired that comes from a life well lived." She felt it then, the shift, the way his breathing had changed, the way he was saying goodbye. "Not yet," she whispered. "Please, not yet." "Got to," he said, "but I'm not afraid. You'll be here. The students will be here. Everything we started will keep going." He took her hand. "Thank you for dragging me through that snow, for warming me with your body, for giving me a life I never imagined possible." "You gave me the same," Miyako said, tears falling. "You taught me that culture lives in kitchens, that breakfast can change the world." "One meal at a time," James said. He took a piece of bacon, ate it slowly, savoring. "Still the best thing I ever tasted. Because you're here." The students started arriving around 8. Word had spread somehow the way it always does in communities bound by love. They came in ones and twos, then dozens. Black and white, young and old generations of students who'd learned to cook and read and live together. They gathered in the yard. Someone started singing, "Amazing Grace." Then others joined. The sound rose like smoke, like prayer, like 50 years of shared meals and shared learning made audible. James listened, his head on Miyako's shoulder. "That's a good sound to leave on," he said. "Still cold." Miyako whispered their old joke, their old comfort. "Never again," James said, "because you're here, because you'll keep the warmth going, because we built something that won't die when I do." His breathing slowed, the singing continued, the bacon smell lingered in the air. James Washington died as he lived, surrounded by community, filled with gratitude, believing in the possibility of better. Miyako held him until Marcus came, until the students needed her, until the business of death required attention. But for those last moments, it was just the two of them on a porch swing, as it had been on so many mornings in so many years since a breakfast cooked with last strength had proven that love transcends every border. The funeral was 3 days later. Over 500 people came. The pine grove couldn't hold them all. They spilled into the fields, into the academy courtyard, into every space James had built or touched or blessed with his presence. Tommy Briggs spoke. Dorothy Sullivan spoke. Marcus spoke, his voice breaking. Miyako spoke last. "He carried recipes across an ocean," she said, "kept them safe through war and hatred and nearly dying, because he understood that culture lives in what we feed each other, that love is expressed in meals shared, that the deepest human connection happens around tables." She looked at the crowd. "He asked me once why I saved him. I said because I could. Now I understand better. I saved him so he could save all of us, so he could show us how to live together, how to feed each other, how to keep choosing warmth over cold love, over fear connection, over division." She paused, looking at the simple casket, at the man who'd changed her life by asking about kitchen supplies while dying in snow. "Thank you, James Washington, for breakfast, for everything that came after, for 52 years of warmth." They buried him in the pine grove under trees that had grown from saplings to giants, just as their impossible love had grown from one breakfast to a movement. The gravestone was simple: James Washington, 1921-1998, "I will warm you with my body." That night, alone in the house for the first time in 46 years, Miyako made bacon, let the smell fill the empty rooms, remembered, and began planning what came next. Miyako was 75 when James died. Everyone assumed she would retire, would fade, would join him soon. Everyone was wrong. She taught for 5 more years, not in the classroom anymore, but training new teachers, passing on the methodology, ensuring that what she and James had built would outlive them both. She traveled between academies, spending weeks at each, observing, correcting, inspiring. At 78, she gave a keynote address at a national education conference. At 79, she appeared on national television, explaining how cooking together breaks down barriers faster than any legislation. "You cannot hate someone who taught you their grandmother's recipe," she said to the camera to millions of viewers. "You cannot fear someone whose hands helped yours shape biscuits." Education through shared culture, through shared meals, builds bridges that politics cannot destroy. The academies continued growing. By 2000, 50 schools in 15 states. By 2003, 60 schools with more in planning. Tommy Briggs's foundation expanded funding not just academies, but any school willing to implement the integrated kitchen model. Dorothy Sullivan's children took over their family bank, specialized in loans to minority farmers and integrated schools. Marcus lived until 2001. At his funeral, his grandson spoke about learning to farm alongside white and black workers, learning that the land didn't care about the color of the hands that worked it. "Uncle James taught me that," the grandson said, "and Aunt Mia taught me that teaching it matters more than knowing it." Ruth's cookbook went into its 15th printing. Every copy sold funded another scholarship. By 2003, over 2,000 students had attended academies on Ruth Washington Memorial Scholarships. On February 14, 2003, Miyako gave her last public lecture at the original academy in the auditorium named for James. 500 people came: students, teachers, families, people whose lives had been changed by one breakfast 57 years before. "I am 80 years old," she said. "I have lived longer than I expected, done more than I dreamed. All because a dying man asked about kitchen supplies and insisted on keeping a promise. All because I chose to help when I didn't have to. All because we both believed that warmth was stronger than cold love, stronger than hate, connection, stronger than division." She looked at the faces, multiple generations, every color, united by shared learning, shared meals, shared belief in better. "Keep cooking together," she said. "Keep eating together. Keep proving that breakfast can change the world. One meal, one moment, one choice at a time." It was her last public appearance. 3 months later, on a May morning, exactly 5 years after James died, with dogwood blossoms drifting past the window, Miyako Tanaka Washington closed her eyes on the porch swing and didn't open them again. She was 80. She had taught for 60 years. She had loved for 52. She had changed the world one breakfast at a time. And like James, she died surrounded by warmth. They buried Miyako beside James in the pine grove. The trees were 60 feet tall now, their roots intertwined beneath the earth, their branches touching overhead. The gravestone matched his Miyako Tanaka Washington, 1923-2003. "Because I could, 20 years have passed since then. The world has changed. Technology has transformed. Politics have shifted. But the Yamamoto Washington Academy Network continues. 70 schools now, 18 states, 15,000 students annually. Every single one with a kitchen at its center. Every curriculum built on the principle that shared meals break down walls faster than any policy. Every February 14th at every academy, students gather at dawn. They cook bacon and coffee. 3 strips, 2 cups, the simplest meal. They eat in silence, honoring the story they've been taught since kindergarten. A Japanese woman found a dying Black American soldier in the snow. She saved him. He cooked her breakfast. They built a world where children learn together, eat together, grow together. At the original academy in Monroe County, Georgia, the ceremony is largest. Students gather in the pine grove where James and Miyako rest. The herb garden planted over burned hate has grown into an acre of teaching plots. The porch swing still moves in the breeze. A young teacher named Keiko leads the ceremony. She wears a locket that belonged to Miyako, that belonged to Ruth before her, that has been passed down through generations of teachers who understood that education is love made tangible. 59 years ago today, Keiko tells the students, a man cooked breakfast with his last strength, and that breakfast changed the world. Not because it was fancy, not because it was complicated, but because it was given with everything he had. because it was received with gratitude, because it proved that culture lives wherever people care enough to feed each other properly. The bacon sizzles, the coffee brews, children who will never know segregation, who cannot imagine a world where skin color determines where you sit or learn or eat, share a meal in silence. The warmth endures. In kitchens across the country, students learn fractions through recipes, practice reading through cookbooks, build friendships over shared meals. Discover that the deepest truths are shared at tables, not podiums. One meal, one choice, one life saved in snow, growing forever. The bacon is gone, the coffee finished, but the warmth endures, when it always will, because some breakfasts change the world, and some choices echo through generations, and some warmth once kindled never dies.